All right. All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our National Training Workshop Encore webinars. Today we are having the presentation Working with Capstone Students to Augment AgrAbility Services, and it is with Cheryl Grenwelch, Faye McGuire, and Mackenzie Thomas. I apologize, you're not on the
that's okay.
slide. Oh, no, it doesn't want to advance. There we go. So just some basic instructions. Please make sure your microphones and phones are muted. If your cameras are off, it just is better bandwidth. If you need closed captioning, you can click the arrow on the CC icon to view or hide the live caption. We will have question and answer period at the end. You can put your questions in the chat box and we will ask them at the end, or you can raise your hand option under the reactions. To aid with attendance taking, please use your first and last name as your Zoom display, and let me know through chat if there is more than one person watching on your computer. At the end, there will be two different surveys. So our presenters have a survey they would like you to answer, and then I will also have a survey for you to answer some brief questions after that. Our session recordings will be archived with the PowerPoint files at agrability.org, and the specific link will be sent to all registrants. If you have any problems today, you can put it in the chat mail or chat window, or you can email me at tmckeil@goodwillfingerlakes.org. And for anybody who's not familiar with AgrAbility, it is a USDA sponsored program that assists farmers and ranchers and other agricultural workers with disabilities. The partnered land grant universities with a disability service organization, and there are currently 21 state projects. The National AgrAbility Project is led by Purdue's Breaking New Ground Resource Center, and the partners include Goodwill of the Finger Lakes, Osteoarthritis Action Alliance, AgriSafe Network, Colorado State University, Washington State University. And for more information about that, you can go to agrability.org. That is the last of mine. I am going to introduce our presenters. Let me just escape out of this. Sorry. And so today we have Dr. Cheryl Grenwelch. She is an assistant professor with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension and project director for Texas AgrAbility Project. She has served as the disability specialist and director since 2009. Dr. Grenwelge received her PhD from Texas A&M University in May of 2010. She has a BS in special education and a master's in education, with an emphasis on educational diagnostics and Texas certification. Her expertise in the disability field and personal background in agriculture give her a distinct level of expertise in working with individuals in the field of agriculture who have acquired a disabling condition. She works closely with the farmers and ranchers and service agencies. These efforts are directed at assisting the individual who has acquired a disabling condition in the agricultural field to return to their chosen profession. Dr. Faye McGuire is a program manager and occupational therapist for Texas AgrAbility and the Battleground to Breaking Ground program. She received her doctorate from MGH Institute of Health Professions in Occupational Therapy in 2021. Her background is in public health and psychology, with a focus on working with individuals with disabilities in a variety of settings. She has a passion for working with veterans and those in agriculture. Combining those two areas of interest, she joined the Battleground program in the spring of 2021 as an intern. During her internship, she had the opportunity to gain hands-on experience at the program's training farms and conducted interviews with past participants. Her research focused on effectiveness of programs like BGBG at helping veterans transition and gain employment in agriculture. After graduating and getting her OT license, Faye officially joined the team as program manager and occupational therapist in October. She is working to help us expand the program by adding and developing course content and working with Battleground participants as they move through the course. She also provides recommendations for clients with disabilities on how to adapt tools and tasks to allow individuals to continue working in agriculture. And last but not least, Mackenzie Thomas has served as the Texas AgrAbility Program Coordinator since 2016 and is co-PI on the current project. She has a personal connection to farmers and ranchers with disabilities, as she is a beginning farmer rancher herself and acquired a disability after a vehicle accident in 2010. Mackenzie holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Agricultural Leadership and Development from Texas A&M University and has completed over 30 hours of continuing education in assistive technology from RESNA. In her role with Texas AgrAbility Project, she contributes her expertise by facilitating client relationships, case management, developing relationships with partners, conducting educational programs and events, assisting with farm and ranch assessments, and providing assistive technology recommendations. Living with a disability herself, she believes that support for individuals with disabilities and chronic health conditions is critical for the success of an individual and agriculture operation. Her greatest career accomplishments are seeing farmers and ranchers achieve their goals and return to work. So with that, I am going to turn it on over to Cheryl and Mackenzie and Faye.
Thank you, Tess. Oh my goodness, that was a mouthful. And when I said that to you, I haven't updated that in about 10 years. And I am associate professor at this point, and I am the PI, or the project director, along with Mackenzie as co-PI and Aaron Kimbrough as co-PI for the project overall. So we have a magnificent team with a lot of experience in multiple ways. And I really appreciate the overview of our team. So we can connect what we do with Capstone students to expand the opportunities for both occupational therapy students to know about AgrAbility and what we do, and to know, and for the medical field overall. And Texas is a big place, and so we struggle with getting that education out, and our occupational therapists can help us with that. We have worked with multiple Capstone students, so today we're going to be sharing how we did that, how that relationship, some of those relationships started, and then the benefits of those things. I think the next slide is the outline of what we'll be talking about today. We'll be talking about, and we already have kind of a team overview, how we relate to different and build our relationship with universities and university programs, how that supports us to meet our grant deliverables, coordination and assessment, expanding our reach is a little bit what I talked about, and the impact on the industry overall, and things that we've learned that might help y'all if you're interested in working with Capstone students to maybe avoid or add in. Our project partners on this, Brazos Valley Center for Independent Living is our nonprofit. Centers for Independent Living, we have 20 plus in the state. Brazos Valley Center for Independent Living is our nonprofit partner and our connection to those centers across the state, and to provide education and support for the individual clients. You've
Sorry,
met some of our.
It's auto advancing, so I might have to jump back and forth. I'm not sure.
Okay, all righty. That's okay. I'll move a little bit quicker. I introduced all the way up to Erin. She covers the battle and is the project director for the Battleground to Breaking Ground program, an affiliated project with AgrAbility. And then Ellie Castillo is our migrant Hispanic farm worker personnel that supports us in that way. The collaboration team, this is a collaboration team when we were working with Faye as an OT intern, and with Megan Skidmore, another OT intern. Dr. Mary Smith was her chair, Megan's chair. We'll let Faye share a little bit more about who her chair was, and Dr. Parthiban is an assistant professor in the engineering department at West Texas A&M University.
And while I was a student, my advisor was Dr. Mary Hildebrand, and she had previously been the occupational therapist for the North Carolina project.
Okay, thank you. So our relationships, we'll be discussing our relationships with these universities and providing a little bit more information on that. Do we have the next slide, Faye, that outlines that? The ways to build these relationships are a relationship. When you saw Dr. Mary Smith, she is the director of an occupational therapy certification program out of St. Augustine in Austin. She reached out to us to provide presentations. Mackenzie, do you remember how long we've been doing that? It's been
probably 4 years or more. So that's kind of where it started. It didn't start at the capacity where we were getting interns or anything like that. We started for 2 to 3 years prior to us ever getting an intern or capstone student helping us with anything. We are simply just providing educational resources and presentations to their classes.
And originally, I think the first presentation was about an hour long, and to the point that we provide like roughly 3 hours of education for their group, somewhere around in there.
We went from just doing like a general, what is AgrAbility, to a full like class period where we were doing case studies and the students were developing their own recommendations and things like that. So it really blossomed just from starting out doing like a informational presentation.
Right. And then with our land grant university partner, I think A&M right now, we have 13 satellite universities around the state, and West Texas A&M, if we flew to, and we're still in Texas, flew to Amarillo, and we knew we had 2 clients in the Amarillo area, and we had no engineer on the program at the time. And so we reached out to the engineering department at West Texas A&M in Canyon, about 60 miles from Amarillo area, and met with Joshua, who has been an amazing partner of ours. And he had capstone students that were involved as well, engineering capstone students. Can you talk about reestablishing past partnerships, Mackenzie?
Sure. So just some like thoughts behind when we had, this kind of stems from having individuals who need services, whether that's assessment or equipment modifications, that may not be eligible for vocational rehab. And so how we kind of match them with ways to get those modifications. And so because we have, contracts with vocational rehab to do assessments, it can be difficult when we don't have that to get everyone there, engineers involved. So we first looked at, do we have partners within our university system that we can reach out to, because they would likely be more, able to help if they have some sort of connection to us. But also one of our engineers, our ag engineer that was on the project previously, was from Sam Houston State University. And so we had a client in that area. And so we reached out, to people who had worked with him before. So it may not be somebody who you've worked with before, but that there's some sort of connection to your project or the university you're at. So they might be more apt to help you out, or somebody that maybe you've worked with 10 years ago. And there's some commonality there. That's kind of where we started with building those relationships.
Right. And then we wanted to give y'all as the audience ideas, if you're currently working with capstone students, or some ideas that you might have kicked around to establish relationships to utilize or work with capstone students. Is there anyone on currently that is interested in moving to establishing partnerships to utilize Capstone students. We utilize Capstone students for multiple things. One of them that we'll talk about in a little while is the engineering students to actually design and develop assistive technology for the clients, particularly in Amarillo. So if anybody wants to share that or think about that, we can come back to that a little bit later.
And they can put ideas in the chat too if we want to come back to them.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Mackenzie about aligning your goals of your grant and how that can connect to working with Capstone students.
Sure. So one thing that, this is kind of something that takes some work, takes some coordination, takes some oversight to develop the relationship, to oversee the students. And so if you think like, okay, well, I mean, that sounds fine and dandy, but why, what does this bring our project? Well, for us, we helped align the things that they were working on to our grant deliverables. So some of the things that we had in our grant was to develop online courses, develop educational materials, do some like data collection type research things, as well as just reaching more clients through AgrAbility services and farm assessments. So what we tried to do is kind of look at the projects through the lens of, okay, what do we need help with our grant deliverables? What gaps are there that maybe these students can fill in? And one of those was needing that expertise from an engineer and engineering students, because we didn't have an engineer on staff at the time to be able to help us conduct the assessment and do modifications and make plans and all of those things. So that was a need that we had that was directly related to our ability to fulfill our grant and those deliverables. And so that's kind of the benefit to us, was aligning those goals and grant deliverables to what we felt like that student or that university could provide.
And as we all know, the grant itself doesn't provide a lot of fiscal ability to hire as many people as you need to get things done. And so this was a really great, you've got students who are already in their senior year, could be of a doctoral program, could be capstone students who are moving through at the end of their degrees, maybe master's degrees. So you're getting some expertise that you wouldn't normally be able to financially support, and then you're also meeting the need of the project overall.
Ready for the next slide, Mackenzie?
Sure. So this is just some ways that we personally connected our goals with those capstone students. Kind of touched on that we needed it. We just needed an ag engineer is what it spawned from, is that we have this assessment. It's 10 plus hours away from where we're located physically. And we didn't have, someone on contract that we could get them traveled out there. So we just thought, how can we get an engineer? Maybe it's someone local to West Texas. And that's kind of where that started. The vocational rehab was not an option for the clients we were serving. So that's not something that we could get support for in that way. And so we needed that kind of expertise. We looked at our land-grant university partner, which was West Texas A&M and Canyon. Our university was really supporting any collaboration we could have with the other sister schools throughout our state. So it was really, well supported from our end as well. We needed some occupational therapy expertise because at the time we didn't have Faye yet. I mean, we did, but she was an intern, but we needed some expertise in that area, as well. And so we were kind of seeking that out. And they needed internship and expertise hours for their doctoral program. And so this was a way to kind of marry all of those things together to kind of be mutually beneficial for everyone involved. The capstone students for engineering needed a project to work on. And I think a lot of times they would try to come up with, ideas of something that they could maybe do, but it may not be connected to like an individual and helping, them meet some need they had. And so we gave them, a task to work on that was kind of innovative, something, they needed ideas as well. So it's kind of ended up being mutually beneficial once we connected our goals with what their goals were.
So one of the things in being a student that was like mutually beneficial, as Mackenzie was talking about, is that myself and the other occupational therapy student at the time, Megan, we put together a fact sheet. So one of the fact sheets that we worked on was traumatic brain injury in agriculture. And it was nice because it let us use our skills as OTs and our expertise, but then also tie it into the agricultural population, since TBI is a very common injury that can happen. And with the last capstone student, she worked on one for lateral epicondylitis, which is also common. Sometimes you hear it called tennis elbow, and really aligning, like if somebody can't get to work with maybe a therapist in their area, like here are some common stretches or different techniques that they may be able to use that are readily available to them. So this here was my project that I did sort of as a culmination of my experience. So what I did is I did a program evaluation of the Battleground program. So I took some of the data that they were already collecting, and then I went out and conducted interviews with participants. So it gave us an idea of what participants were finding helpful and what areas that we needed to improve the program. And it happened to align that when I was a student, we were in the process of writing the proposal for the next grant cycle. So we were actually able to take some of the recommendations that participants had given to us to incorporate them into making improvements for the next grant cycle. And it also gave me, I don't come from an agriculture background at all. So through the experience, once a week, I was able to go out to one of our training farms and actually get hands-on production experience, which I found really helpful because I had the OT knowledge. And you can look at a video all day long and say, oh, like I know what that's like, but until you actually go out and do it, you don't really know what it feels like or what the farmer or rancher is going through. So I found it really helpful that I was able to get some of that hands-on experience so that I could provide better recommendations to farmers and ranchers in the future.
And then this is another example of something that our OT students worked on that were part of our kind of grant deliverables, but also aligned with what they were needing to do as part of their capstone project. So they have kind of like an experience portion and then like the developing of materials type situation. And so in research, and so Faye, like that was her research project, but she also had these experience hours to get, and that was the same way with this student, Megan Skidmore, who helped us with this occupational therapy course. So this was part of her like kind of classroom hours, and then she also needed experience hours. And when you're thinking about well, how much help really can these capstone students be, they were up to 40 hours a week almost, working specifically with our project. And so there was a lot of time and resources that they had to devote to this, so they could get a lot done in one semester. They only have them for that semester, but if there's a project that you can get kind of knocked out and going for them, they have a lot of time to devote to it. And Megan basically developed this course for us as part of her experience time. She did the research, she put together modules, filmed the videos, made little quizzes and fact sheets and supporting documents for it. And so during her 3 or 4 months with us, not only did she help with doing the farm assessments and writing recommendation reports and justifications, but also, an actual course or a physical something that she developed as part of that.
And with that module, Mackenzie, we were able to get it certified as a course to deliver to occupational therapists for their CEUs. their
Right. So
continuing
we,
education units.
and that's not something that we ever, had planned on in as part of our grant necessarily. We just wanted to provide the education. And then when we were discussing this with, the students and also her advisors are like, if you have this and there's farmers or individuals that are occupational therapists or rural health professionals and they need this education, if they're working with farmers and ranchers, you could probably get that accredited and offer some CEUs for that course. And so we got that approved through the Texas Occupational Therapy Association to offer CEUs for that. And we also were able to kind of develop a second Capstone students research project from this course where they actually evaluated the course for how effective it was, and kind of like Faye did with our battleground course, just determining how effective it was and seeing what could be improved and that type of thing. So we kind of got 2 research projects or development projects out of this one grant deliverable for students to work on.
Ideally, we're hoping for a third through continuing that partnership with that university. We're hoping that they send us students typically in the spring, so that next spring we might have a student who can come in and take the findings from the last student and actually make updates to improve the course.
And then with this, I saw a question a minute ago that I'll let y'all speak to. It was how many sessions are in the course, how many hours. I would assume that they're one of the questions that they're asking. But another note is that our occupational capstone students really, they went out with us and supported the assessments. And Faye actually moved from Boston to Austin, Texas. And so they got hands-on working experience in conducting assessments. And then they worked individually in interviewing the client themselves to talk about how they were operating within their homes, what their physical limitations were specifically, and then to make recommendations for us as we were developing the full-blown assessment documentation for the individuals. And so there were multiple components that went into this. And then I'll turn that over to you, Faye, to talk about how many hours, how many sessions, those kinds of things about the course.
So right now the course, I believe, is credited for, is it 6 hours?
I think it's 6 hours and there's like 8 or 9 modules. So they're not very long module videos. And it's only accredited through the Texas Occupational Therapy Association. So it's not AOTA yet. That's kind of a future goal when we get a little more fleshed out, but it is accredited starting today for the next year for 6 hours of OT continuing education. And I can drop a link to it in the chat for y'all in just a minute, or have maybe Tess send it out after the webinar's over so that you can take a look at it and see if it's something you might be interested in.
Sorry, I see there's another question. Oh, okay, perfect.
So coordination of the assessment for y'all, I assume that maybe, and maybe I shouldn't be assuming that all of y'all are connected to an AgrAbility project. In being able to coordinate an assessment, there's a lot that's involved in that. Mackenzie, I can let you talk a little bit more about this, but there had to be an agreement between West Texas A&M. When universities get involved, there's a lot of legal ease and all of those kinds of things that have to be attended to when there's this type of collaboration. And there are others in coordination in working with universities. I'll let Faye speak to that in receiving a capstone student. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Mackenzie, to talk about the coordination of the West Texas A&M project.
Sure. Yeah, so basically their university kind of drafted up an agreement stating what they would provide, what our project is providing as far as the students go, plus, you know, to add more confusion, that what the liability a kind of agreement or whatnot liability releases between the client and those students and their university. So that is something that had to be developed, that if we were anticipating, you know, that those students working on a project for a client, that would state, you know, what safety risk there might be, you know, that of course this is all looked over from, you know, a board of engineers at West Texas A&M after the students did the design and those types of things, as well as not just the OT students themselves, but their coordinator who was, you know, a professor at an OT school. So that's, you know, that gives you some reasonable expectation that's been looked over and vetted, but you have to have something kind of in writing, an agreement as to who's providing what, you know, what the understanding is between you and the students, as well as the students and the clients, and vice versa. So that there is something that's something you have to keep in mind if you're planning to work with students. Most capstone projects have their own way of kind of setting up those expectations, and they all looked a little differently depending on what university they were from, but it's really important that everyone's on the same page as to what, you know, what each person's part is in this, because it's really our relationship with the client that can be affected. So making sure all of that's kind of fleshed out at the beginning is always best, I think.
And I know, like for my school, they would have us start to reach out to potential locations almost 2 years in advance, just because we work on our projects through the whole time that we're in school. So I reached out to Erin in this case almost 2 years before I actually started with the project. And at least on the part of the student, it's also understanding that there needs to be some flexibility, because we are driven by grants, that the projects that, you know, we might come up with students may not meet the needs of the program that we're going to work with. So having some flexibility on that end, so that you can kind of understand the student might need to adapt to what you're doing. And then there's, in addition to having like the memorandum of understanding, at least from like the OT perspective, we had to make sure that the project cleared not only our IRB through like my university, but also making sure that it was going to clear the IRB through Texas A&M as well. So that process can often be pretty lengthy. Cheryl, you're muted.
That memorandum of understanding had to come from Faye's university to our university, and then it had to go to our university legal department. It's a signed document of what we'll provide and what Faye's university support would provide for the individual. And it was probably a 2-month process, basically, to get that document signed.
One document, yeah. And I know the IRB process, at least within my organization, and I also went through during COVID, was over 6 months.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it's a long process.
So if you think that it's going to, like, if there's a project that you need to get done, say next quarter, or whatever, starting on it sooner than later, because there may be a lag before you can actually get the work started or the students can start working on it. So developing those relationships first and kind of fleshing some of that out before the students actually start their semester is always helpful. Gives them more time.
So this next piece is, we have 2 case studies that we did. So these were 2 different clients that I got to work with along with Megan and the engineering students while we were doing our Capstone project. So for this one, we got together as the AgrAbility team. Some of us were in person and some of us were remote, just due to location and to COVID still being in its peak during the time. And what was really nice is that we got to work collaboratively, like with Mackenzie and Cheryl and Aaron, who had a lot of the knowledge and expertise already. So we got to learn under them. But we also got to bring in like the OT perspective, and the engineers brought in the engineering perspective. And then as a group, we were able to work collaboratively on that. These are the kind of like blueprints. So the engineering students designed a lift for the client to be able to get into his tractor. And these were some of the blueprints that they designed. And one of the things that was, at least that I found really cool, is that we were then, like, the engineering students were really good at doing the engineering piece. And then we got to bring like in as the OT, like our experience. So like the first 2 designs weren't really going to be as feasible for the client because he had limited trunk control. So unless there was some sort of seatbelt or like armrests added, they weren't going to be safe for the client. So from an engineering perspective, they were going to work really well, but from like the OT and safety disability perspective, they weren't going to be feasible for the client. So that's kind of how we got to collaborate as Capstone students to make something that would kind of meet in the middle, that would meet the client's needs, but also be structurally sound, but safe.
And a little bit of background about this particular individual. Was an individual that had a brain lesion that caused stroke-like impact to his physical body, and so limited balance, limited trunk control. Faye can speak to other limitations, but his physician had cleared him that his overall physical condition was stable at the time. So we weren't looking at progression of the disability itself.
Yeah, so he had paralysis on one side of his body, which led to sort of that limited trunk control. And it made it harder for him to transfer since there was that paralysis on one side of his body. So we had to take that into consideration too. So like on the last picture on the left, the right, he wouldn't be able to use armrests that were fixed to be able to transfer as easily, as opposed to something that might be movable to get out of his way.
And I think it's important, like Faye touched on, that to have, like, if you're going to work with just say engineering students, is having kind of somebody on your team that just because like the engineering lens, they said, yeah, this looks good to me. They're not looking at it from the lens of somebody that knows about disability or someone that knows about safety. And so it's very important when you're working with students to have someone on your team or that you have access to kind of talk through that with them. We had multiple meetings with them where we discussed these options, where we said why things were not, they were safe as an aspect of like the build of them, but not for the client and what their needs were. But it also gave, the students some real world experience on working with individuals, and that just because something looks good on paper doesn't mean that it may be the best fit for the individual. And so I think that was like a really helpful experience for them to get to work with OT students and occupational therapists, as well as like the engineering side of that.
And then these are just some pictures of the students, the engineering students. Us as OT students, because it was so far away, we didn't attend this particular assessment or the build in person, but these are the engineering students working on the actual lift that they were building for this client. And this is when they were actually installing the client, installing the lift for the client. And then the last picture, I believe, is the client testing out the lift.
And I don't remember the exact cost of this lift, but it was significantly less than a commercially built lift, and it was paid for. It can always be paid for, but West Texas A&M's engineering department funded the materials, etc., and all of the installation, all of that. They funded that process, and so if I'm remembering right, it was between the $2,000 and $3,000 range, and many of our commercial lifts are in the $12,000 to $15,000 range.
Right. And I think because they have a budget for these capstone students to kind of work on these projects, it sounded like, they had some ability to fund some of the materials. And so you're looking at, as far as benefit to the client, while they may have, may work with the students, and the students may need to come out 3 or 4 times and fit something and make some tweaks. And it's kind of a learning process for them. They got a significantly less expensive modification to that equipment than if they had gone out and purchased it themselves.
And then one of the benefits, and they have several projects that do this, is that involvement, like Mackenzie said, of that engineering student, and understanding what they do impacts ultimately the end user, the client, and to consider disability when they're doing that. And often they're never provided that experience in any other way, as far as I know. So it changes some industry, possibly allows them to move into the industry itself after graduation, and possibly impact the overall industry itself.
So then this second case study, we worked with a client who had a spinal cord injury, and he also, secondary to that, had autonomic dysreflexia, which, if you're not familiar with, it's sort of a secondary condition that comes along with spinal cord injury, and it can be life-threatening since it alters the person's heart rate. And so for this client, we worked with the engineering students to create a lift that would lift his saddle onto the horse and then lift him onto the saddle once it was already on the horse. Again, we were brought in remotely for this one, just due to all the different circumstances. And again, we had, as the OTs, we worked with our advisors if we had any questions about what may be like safe or unsafe. And then the engineering students worked with their professor. And then again, we worked collaboratively as a team. So here's the mock-up for the lift that they were thinking about. And then from the OT perspective, again, we kind of brought in like what's going to be safe. So when they built this stall for where they were going to put the horse, we talked about, are there any areas where if the person is in his wheelchair as he is putting the saddle on the horse, that he could get stuck? Like, is he going to get pinned between any of the side rails that could potentially lead to an additional injury? And having the autonomic dysreflexia, we had to be careful about what type of seating system that he was going to be in that would lift him onto the horse, so that there was nothing that was going to cause any excessive rubbing or pressure to trigger an event.
And a little bit more about this particular client. This particular client could work with VR, and we are currently still in the process of doing that. But for him, and with his particular disability, he has a 10,000 acre ranch. And so it's a cattle ranch, and he will never be able to stay on his horse in a lengthy period enough time to work cattle. And so this was more a goal of the individual in a recreational sense, and that does not move into the VR realm when they're looking specifically at employment. So we couldn't justify a lift for getting him on his horse if it wasn't going to be a proactive way of supporting employment where he currently was. And so a little bit different than the prior client in that that lift specifically was for, he had 1,800 acres of row crops that he utilized his tractor and those kinds of things for. A little bit different reason why he wasn't connected to vocational rehab. But in this instance, this was a goal of the individual, more in a recreational fashion.
So here are some examples of the different ideas that the engineering students came up with. And again, we put the OT perspective to kind of talk through whether or not they'd be safe. So the harness was something that we had kind of gone back and forth on whether or not that would cause any excessive pressure for the client. And we also incorporated the client in some of these conversations just because they're really the expert on their disability and limitations. So he had a better idea of, like this may or may not trigger some of my symptoms. So we had some conversations with him as well. And these are some pictures of the engineering students actually starting to put together the lift for the client. And then this is them actually installing the lift on the client's property, testing it out. And then I don't know, Cheryl, Mackenzie, if you want to talk a little bit more to this, but the importance of like the follow-up. I believe, I forget which client it was now, but there had to be some modifications that were made after the fact.
Yeah, I think it's just really important. We talked a little bit about like the pre-working with students plan, but that you definitely have a follow-up plan because these are Capstone students. They're in their final semester of college, whatever program they're in. And so there's a good chance that they will not be students after, you do this project. And so if you run into any issues, the key was working with the professor primarily and building that relationship foremost, and making sure that, should something happen, the professor or whoever was overseeing this on the student side was bought into making it work. Because if they left and graduated, spring break happened, something like that, and they're out of pocket, having a way to get in touch with them. And then, making sure you share everyone's contact information, and then having some sort of follow through. So if this extends past their semester, you can't just leave. Like, for example, one of these, they did the installation and there was a little electrical glitch that came up whenever the client was trying to use the equipment. And so those students were gone and they were like, well, we're emailing their university email, but if you were anything like me, the minute I graduated, I never checked that email again. So they weren't getting it. And so the professor ended up going out and making sure it was made right. But it was because, we had a really good relationship with the professor and he was very bought into what we were doing, that he did that. So if that had not happened, that, would have kind of cast a bad light on us and the project as a whole. So making sure kind of beforehand that you have a follow-up and follow-through plan to make sure that everyone's on the same page should something happen. And that another thing was like making sure you take photos and do the filming and whatnot if you want to use this as a story in the future, because those students leave and graduate and they may not be in state anymore, and getting in touch with everyone to go like, oh, everything's done and the farmer got to use this after their first harvest or whatnot, those students may not be around. So making sure that, you know, when it's happening, you get really good documentation of it, should you ever want to use that for a story or some sort of marketing after the fact.
So overall, our benefits to our project, economic impact, we actually put a dollar amount to the overall economic impact to the client, to that we leveraged in being able to get this to the project overall. I can't right offhand remember, but it was significant. It was, you know, $20,000 to $25,000. We were able to, if y'all are familiar with cases within VR, maybe y'all's are a little different than ours, but the cases going through VR sometimes are lengthy. I think our average is roughly 2 years. And from the time that we start the process, do the assessment, and then they are delivered the equipment, that's a lengthy period of time. And farmers and ranchers, their work goes on. They can't just, so we were able to, within a period of 4 to 6 months, be able to start the process, do the assessment, and they were delivered the equipment and they were able to utilize it. And so that timeliness of delivery of services was very impactful for the client overall. We were able to reach areas that we're typically not able, or we do, but it struggled to reach in underserved areas. We're able to market our programs like the OT to the medical field. I do a lot of traveling across the state. Less so now that everybody's familiar with Zoom and Teams and those kinds of ways to present, but being able to market it and make opportunities for different audiences to understand what we do, which provides more referrals. We have a multi-state reach because of Faye's connection from coming in from Boston. She currently resides in Rhode Island. She will be moving to the state of Texas. So we have a multi-state reach. And then we were able to meet our goals and deliverables in a excellent way in that we might not have been able to without the connection. In other words, the expertise that was involved in meeting those deliverables was above and beyond what we imagined it to be. And I'll turn that back over to you, Mackenzie.
Awesome. Yeah. So another thing that was really important, I think, when you looking back, was the impact it made on the students and their industry. They gave them hands-on experience with people with disabilities that some of them, like the engineering students, probably never would have had. You know, their typical Capstone experience probably doesn't allow them, you know, not going to be working with people with disabilities, but it gave them you know, exposure to AgrAbility, what AgrAbility does. So there was 2 different teams, I think of 3 or 4 students each, that worked on those projects. So roughly like 8 students that worked with those farmers. And so that's 8 people in that engineering industry, whatever they do, whether it's with agriculture or not, because these were not agriculture engineering students. So it also got them, they're in a heavily like farm influenced community. So most of them had some experience with agriculture, came from a farm family, but some of them didn't. And so it got them exposure to agriculture, to working with people with disabilities. And so whatever they do in the future, they have that kind of lens that they can see that through. And we've even connected one of our engineers that helps us on our current grant was a student that worked with our project when they were in college. And that's why, you know, they were passionate about it still, probably 10 years later, and, you know, came on board as an engineer for us now. And so those relationships really, that impact of that, I think, lasts a long time after this, you know, 4 or 5 month, you know, project is over. And also it increased for us because we did a couple of research projects as part of those capstone experience through Faye and one of our other students, Maggie, who is here in this picture, is that it increases the amount of research that's out there about our programs and what rural health disparities there are. And so that's something that's been really neat to kind of develop over that time, is just increasing the amount of data and information that's out there about our programs and how they're helpful.
And the lessons that we learned was what those expectation and timelines, particularly with Faye and Megan, they were our first interns, is that these individuals, again, like we talked about a little bit earlier, is that they have 4 to 5 months to do this. They need roughly 40 hours a week worth of time for them to work on things. And so you have to work within their expectations, the expectations of the client, meeting our goals overall and our expectations. So there's some coordinating of those things. You have to have somebody on staff. Mackenzie did an awesome job of mentoring and overseeing their internships and the Capstone project, and communication back and forth with all collaborating partners. Again, it's a quick turnaround. And it does provide you opportunity for those ongoing relationships like Mackenzie talked about, and also knowing that not all your relationships end in success. And so, you know, having multiple avenues for developing those relationships is important. And we have really benefited as a project overall. I think the state has really benefited in our ability to serve. Again, Texas is a large state, and it's definitely worth it. And we have Faye because we let her do her capstone project. So it's all been worth it for sure.
And I think another thing that we kind of learned too, now having had a few rounds of students, is that the level of dedication that the student has is going to vary, and how interested they're going to be in the project may vary. And it's a lot harder to work with a student who's not as interested than to work with a student who is, because if they're not as interested, you spend more time coming up with things for them to do, versus a student who's interested and motivated will seek out those opportunities. And I think it does have an impact on the person like Mackenzie who oversees them in terms of like what the student is capable and motivated to do.
Right. And we don't have to take students, you know, that's kind of up to our discretion on if there's a capstone student interested, just because, you know, if you develop a relationship and you see that that student may not be a good fit for your project, or what they're researching on doesn't really fit in well with what you're doing with your grant, that's not something that you have to take on by any means. And just knowing that, you know, that is a time commitment, it is oversight, it is a lot of communication back and forth for the period that they're on, making sure you set realistic and hard and fast expectations for them and hold them accountable if they're not meeting those expectations, because it is something that, like Faye, we had to sign off on that she could get her degree. And if she didn't meet those expectations, it was important that, you know, everyone know, because that was, you know, it would discredit the degree that she was getting. So it is important, and it is a lot of oversight and management, but it was definitely worth it to do all of that for what we got out of it. So I'll leave it up for questions. Any questions? And I'm also going to put the survey link. I'll stick it in the chat for you guys for just a quick survey on our end of the presentation, but we'll be here if anyone has any questions or feedback or ideas from your projects.
Well, thank you, ladies. Those were a wonderful presentation. I don't see any questions in the chat at this time. Again, feel free if anybody wants to put any questions in the chat. And then I also added a survey link to for the NAP. So if you wouldn't mind filling out both of those, I will stay on for a few minutes too, just to make sure those links stay live for people. But again, if you've got a question, you can either unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat. So thanks again, ladies.
And here's our email address. So if anyone has questions later on too, you can feel free to reach out or give us a call.
Perfect. And if you forget that or can't get that email down, and you could send them to me and I will forward them on also. So.
Okay, well, Tess, thank you for the opportunity for us to provide this presentation, and we'll just hang out for a few minutes in case anybody comes up with questions, and look for your emails or their emails if they do.
Sure.
Think about it later.
Perfect. Thank you. Hey, and check the website if you want to do some presentations for next year's NTW.
Yeah.
Yep, the presentation proposals are up for NTW.
Yeah. All right. Thank you again, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you.